Good morning, everyone. Super honored to be here with you today. I want to just a couple of quick things before I hand it to Stephanie. So task force members, we would ask that you're on video, just so that we, as panelists and whatnot, are speaking and facilitators as well, that we know who's on the task force. And then members of the public, if you wouldn't mind right now, taking yourself off of video so that the task force can really have conversations with one another and know who's here. The second piece is we'll offer public comment at each meeting, and there will be an opportunity at the end. If you are present right now and you know you would like, excuse me, for to do public comment, please just send me a note in the chat and I'll go ahead and start building a queue. If at any time during the meeting you would like to do public comment, you can also reach out then, and I'll do one last final call for public comment at the end. The other piece with that is just depending on how many folks we have, we'll let you know how much time we're able to give to everyone. Ideally, we have plenty of time, but if we have a very large queue, that might limit the time. So videos on for task members, videos off for folks that are not task force members, public comment. The last thing I'll say is that because this is a public meeting, we've restricted the chat because that would need to be something that folks watching in digitally would need to be able to see. So you are able to chat to the hosts and the co-hosts, but you can't chat, with one another through the chat feature. So if you do have something to say or you want to jump in as a task force member, you're welcome to jump in, online, but we're just restricting the chat. And we would just ask that members of the public restrict any comments from their end to public comment at the end. I believe that's it. So Stephanie, I'll hand it back to you. Thanks.
That was our PSA, our public service announcement. So good morning, everybody. I need everyone to wave or wink or smile, something. Excellent. Thank you. Good to see you all, and Happy New Year, and welcome to our second task force meeting for the Mandatory Reporting Task Force. It's great to be here today with all of you. With the new year, I'm really excited about our meeting today and our ability to really present you with some really terrific speakers and some really good informational materials that were sent to you. So I hope all of you had an opportunity to review some of those. Uh-oh, am I echoing? Is that me, Trace, now? Okay.
You are a little bit, but I'm tracking down and muting folks if I need to, so you're good.
Okay, sorry. So yes, just first order of business on our agenda. I would like to, I'm going to go out of order for just a moment and just start with our meeting minutes. All of you were sent the December 7th, 2002 meeting minutes. And I just wanted to, I'll just assume everybody has received those. I will also just assume that task force members have reviewed those. And now I will just ask if there are any hands showing that we need some additions, deletions, corrections at this time. Do I see anybody? I'm looking at my screens. I see no hands up. Great. I did have some technical revisions that I have given to our team, and really they're just spelling errors, just little things, nothing substantive. Rather than take the task force through all of those, again, there was nothing substantive to my edits. So with that, I would ask for a motion to go ahead and pass those minutes, and a second, please.
I'll offer the first motion.
Great. That was Michelle Dawsey, and somebody to second that.
I'll second.
Thank you, Ashley Chase. And I will do this in reverse order. Is there anybody opposed to passing the minutes as they are presently constituted, minus those, what I'll call technical corrections? Great. I see no opposition, so those meeting minutes will pass. Thank you. So yes, all of you should be in possession of your agenda for today, and we will be walking you through all of that. I want to go through some additional housekeeping matters before I turn it over to Jennifer. As a task force, it is always so helpful to have a task force chair in case I win the lottery and I get to move across the world permanently. It would be great to have somebody else here. So I would ask you all to consider being a vice chair. I won't put you on the spot today, but if you could please just let us know, email me, Jordan, Trace, Jen, of your interest, that would be great. I will tell you it is a fairly minor role. It really would just involve obviously attending the minutes and really just helping us prior to any meeting, reviewing the prior meeting minutes, reviewing the current agendas. We're interested in your ideas, your suggestions to those agendas, and really just helping us prepare for each meeting in advance. I think maybe it'd probably be about an hour of time prior to each meeting that is being held. So just to give you an idea of what kind of commitments you would be making. And I do hope you all will consider that. And we will finalize that at our next meeting in, April. So at this point, the only other housekeeping matter I have is this. I don't know, how many of you used to like seeing people in person? Anybody else besides me? Yeah. And I really miss that, especially in groups like this, where there are a lot of new faces. We're talking about some really critical issues. And we used to just have great dialogue, walking into meetings and in between breaks and leaving meetings and having lunches. And so because we don't really have the ability to do that, I will be sending out just an email to connect with each one of you one-on-one. You will get that email and it will have my schedule in there, and all you have to do is click a time slot. And, really it's just for me to get to know you better. It's also for me to really understand, what are your passions? How do we bring your passions in deeper into these conversations? If you have concerns about the task force and its content or how it's operating, I want to know that too. I just really believe it's important to check in one-on-one. This is a 2-year-long project. And so I really do want to get to know each of you and maximize your talents and what you bring to the conversation. So you will be seeing that email from Jen and I just ask that you kindly respond because I think it'll be fun. So other than that, I don't have any other housekeeping matters. I am going to turn it over to Jennifer, our Director of Policy, who is going to review some of the themes and the Jamboard themes, I should say, and some of the work that we did at the last meeting, just to give us a refresher and get us back sort of oriented on the same page. And then we'll start getting into more of the substance of today's agenda. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. So I had posted to the Dropbox. If you're having any trouble with the Dropbox, please just feel free to reach out. But what we did, if you'll recall, we asked you at our last meeting what your biggest concerns were regarding mandatory reporting. And we put that on a Jamboard. And then we took your 1001 stickies and pulled it off. I was so impressed with all of your input. There was not a lot of repeats, so there were so many good ideas. So our task then was to roll those up into themes. So in your Dropbox, let me share my screen so you can see the document. There is there's a list. So I've rolled these up. You can click on each of these arrows to roll them down so you can see these were all the stickies. There were some repeats. So some of the stickies had ideas that sort of fit under one or more themes, so that you will see some repetition, but otherwise we've tried to roll these up into broader themes. We came up with 7 and really trying to get at, what are these larger issues that we want to address through this process. So these are our themes. And then let me see if I can switch over. Can you see a new document now? I'm looking at Trace. Okay, so so in the red are those themes that you just saw from the Jamboard. And again, that was the question about your biggest concerns regarding mandatory reporting. And what we've done is we've aligned those to the 19 directives set about in the legislation. They kind of go in order, which was very interesting. I mean, it just shows that this task force is very much aligned to the issues raised in the legislation. So you'll see all of them. A lot of these are clarity issues, which we've put over in this right-hand column. And then we bring back number 18 and 19 over here in the middle. So what we've tried to do is roll these up into these 3 large themes and create this framework that's going to guide how we address each of these directives, because we want to make sure that we're hitting each of these throughout this process.
Hey, Jen.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't think we're seeing the right screen right now.
Oh, okay.
Now that you're talking, sorry.
Uh,
A new document, but I wasn't sure which document.
How's
There
that?
we go.
All right.
Perfect. Thank you.
So what you can see is, again, in the red are those themes that we've pulled out of the Jamboard, and underneath are the directives with these Roman numerals. And then again, we rolled these up into these 3 broad themes. So effectiveness and impact, alternatives and resources, and clarity and technical support. So again, this will provide the framework for how we proceed, and it'll help us keep track of addressing each of these directives. So are there any questions? And again, this is in your Dropbox. This is probably something that will continue to evolve. So if we identify a new theme or we want to clarify one of the themes, we can certainly do that. All right. I think it's back to you, Stephanie.
Great. All right. So, picking up on sort of that very first theme that Jen has listed there, the law requires us, literally shall, to analyze the effectiveness of the mandatory reporting law here in Colorado. And I'm just going to read what the actual requirement for us is, because it relates to the work that Jen just said, which is really that the task force shall analyze the effectiveness of mandatory reporting, including its relationship with systemic issues, the disproportionate impact of mandatory reporting on under-resourced communities, communities of color, and persons with disabilities. So when we're talking about effectiveness, I think, at least at this point, there seem to be 3 questions about effectiveness. Really, one is mandated reporting, and again, Colorado's law, effective in keeping children safe? That is the first sort of question. A second question is our mandatory reporting law the most effective way to get family and children resources that aren't otherwise, right, engaged in any sort of abusive act? The third piece of effectiveness is, does the law work effectively for all of the mandated reporters who are required to follow it, right? Is the law clear? Is it providing people with the details that they need? Are mandated reporters served by the systems designed to collect those calls, right? Is that an effective relationship? So, when we talk about effectiveness, it's really from sort of these three buckets, if you will. Today, you're going to have an overview on how mandatory reporting fits into the overall child welfare structure. And also you will hear from speakers who will be talking about the disproportionate impacts that mandatory reporting has on various communities. So we will be addressing that today. Additionally, over the next several meetings, we're going to dedicate our time to hearing from how, again, the law works. Is it effective from a variety of groups? So you will hear from additional professionals. You will hear from parents and families. You will also hear, from those communities that are required to report. So by way of saying, today is sort of our what I call the 30,000-foot overview as we begin to dig into that effectiveness question. So the good news, we are on track. This addresses, again, our initial 2 directives. Really, the goal at this point would be to work on this effectiveness question really over the next year. It's probably one of the single biggest pieces that exist within our charge at this point. And then, of course, we'll be working, I hope by December, into the category of what are alternatives or other resources, other systems that might be available for us to address the myriad of needs that are being sort of interjected into our mandatory reporting system. So just to give you a little bit of a framework on that. The only other thing I want to comment on is that one of the themes that came out loud and clear from our last meeting, which I actually wrote some notes on this, and it was really everybody expressed a desire to be bold, to be innovative. And I thought that was really exciting. Some of the quotes that I wrote down were, want Colorado to be a shining example to the rest of the country on how mandatory reporting laws can work. We want to be innovative. We want actual change, system change. We want something actionable. We don't want to just do pro forma changes, right? We don't just want to wordsmith. I just wanted to bring us all back to that as we have our conversations today. You know, there really is a desire by this group to be bold and to step into some new ideas, creative ideas, a very different space than I think, you know, any of us have had to be as it relates to this particular issue. So I look forward to being bold today with all of you. And with that, Doris, I will hand it over to you to kick us off.
Awesome, fantastic. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to pull up my deck here real quick. Awesome. So I am going to let you all know straight away that in order to see the full screen of my presentation, I'm going to minimize my Hollywood Squares boxes. So I can't see if somebody comes off of mute or raises their hand. So if there is a question that you have, feel free to just interject and cut me off. And we'll make sure that we leave time at the end for questions as well, but wanted to just let you know I can't see you if you're like waving boldly for me to stop. So just come off mute and interrupt. So today's conversation is going to be really focused on continuing to level set. We know that that we have folks on the task force who have really deep knowledge and experience in child welfare. And you know, coming from various different perspectives. So using this opportunity in thinking about the effectiveness of Colorado's system, including at the front door where mandatory reporting resides, wanting to you know, provide sort of like this basic or baseline overview of some of the impacts of the child welfare system today. As to kids and families from various subpopulations, to begin thinking about, you know, what might be some opportunities to do things a little bit differently. So we'll have some rich data that we'll go through for those of you who aren't data geeks, which I am not. You know, hopefully your eyes won't gloss over. But really, this is helping to inform the story behind that. When I think about data, I think about data representing actual kids and actual family experiences. And so I ask that when you are looking at the numbers and hearing about the numbers from me, that you're thinking about them through the lens of real people, real kids, real families, and the experiences that they have currently with the system. So the goals in the presentation today are really just twofold. One, to begin to look at the disparities and disproportionality that exists in the child welfare system. There will be some data that looks at national data and also Colorado data, and then where Colorado sits inside the national landscape. And then understanding the decision points that have the greatest impact on child and family involvement and their experiences in child welfare. So like every system, there are multiple places at which that system makes decisions that impact the population served. Child welfare is no different. And so, you know, again, while this task force is focused on mandatory reporting, understanding the impacts on the system at the front door, but also all throughout the system, and where disproportionality and disparities tend to show up and or are exacerbated. So before we get into that conversation, because we are talking about the impact of race and racism and other forms of identity oppression that are woven through all of our systems in the United States, including child welfare. I think it's important for us to ground the conversation with some guidelines, recognizing that whenever you talk about racism and other isms, it has the tendency to make people uncomfortable. I'm not blind to that. I do this work a lot, so it's very comfortable for me, but I recognize that for some of you, this may, just the topic itself may automatically raise your level of discomfort. So these are really reflective prompts for you to just sort of be attuned to where you are, how you're feeling, how you're approaching the conversation, and to serve as just an opportunity for you to think about the places at which you have discomfort, and just to acknowledge that, and also to think about and sort of check and balance the extent to which your discomfort might influence how you approach the conversation with others. So the first is to just strive for humility, recognizing that we will grapple with challenging ideas, differentiate between your opinion and informed knowledge, whereas informed knowledge really comes from sustained experience, study, and practice. And your opinion really just comes from your own point of view and perspective. Hold your opinions lightly and with humility. Again, recognizing that that not everyone who is on the Zoom today comes from the same set of experiences, and so their opinions may differ a little or a lot. Notice your own defensive reactions and attempt to use those reactions as entry points for gaining deeper self-knowledge, rather than as a rationale for closing off. Our human reaction to discomfort is to sort of stiffen up and sometimes or many times become defensive. So notice when you're starting to feel that inside your body, and hold it, and sort of like think about what the conversation topic is at the time and what it is that is making you uncomfortable, and really use that as an opportunity to dig deeper into where you might have an opportunity to open up. Recognize how your own social positionality, we all have them, be that race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, education, socioeconomic status informs your perspectives and reactions to information that's shared, and sort of again use that as another opportunity to go deeper into the conversation. Differentiate between safety and comfort. We know that these conversations can be uncomfortable, and naming and thinking about our own contributions to disproportionate harm can make us, again, that going back to the defensiveness, become defensive because it's uncomfortable. But use that discomfort as an opportunity to grow, because we know that in any growth opportunity, discomfort is necessary, whether it's working out and trying to improve your own physical wellness. Similarly, learning and expanding your knowledge and competency in the space of equity also requires pushing through discomfort. Identify where your learning edge is and push it. Our goal is to grow in our learning, and so if there's something that that you already know, look for those opportunities where there's new knowledge, or where you can independently go deeper in your learning about any of the topics that we're talking about today. And then this last one, I think, is important for all of us as we continue to think about and engage in ways to shift and move in our own equity journeys. Disproportionality is a priority that was named at our last meeting, and so in order to address disproportionality, it requires improving our collective and individual skills in equitable practice, design, and thinking. And a way to do that at a very internalized way is by engaging with counter stereotypic imagery. I was getting ready to say next slide, but then I'm controlling the PowerPoint. Awesome. So we know that race is a powerful predictor of experiences and outcomes in every domain inside the United States, including and in every system inside the United States, including the child welfare system. And so we're going to talk about the impact of an experience of race within the child welfare sector at all of the decision points. So the reason why we are centering race and using this sort of framework that is intended to be intersectional is because race, like no other characteristic, has been baked into our government and systems and has resulted in deep and persistent inequities across identities. Leading with race and understanding the ways in which systems and institutions either introduce or perpetuate inequities provides a framework that can be applied to other forms of oppression, whether you're looking at gender-based or sexuality-based outcomes or ability-based outcomes. It's a framework that can be applied to other forms of oppression. And then lastly, and I think perhaps most importantly, because conversations about race and racism are so uncomfortable, when work is undertaken to address oppression that doesn't explicitly name the impact of race, race is often left out. And that default position then means that when you're talking about gender, or you're talking about sexuality, or you're talking about ability, the default position is white and so the compounding impact of race and those other identity factors ends up left out of the conversation. Centering race is really important to really tackling that deep-seated issue in a meaningful way. So let's talk about the ways in which race actually has shows up in the data in terms of experiences and outcomes. In the United States, children of color are more likely to live in poverty. Black and Indigenous Americans and Alaska Natives have much lower rates of upward mobility and higher rates of downward mobility than their white counterparts, which has led to and continues to lead to persistent disparities across generations. Differences in parental marital status, education, and wealth also tend to explain little of the Black-white income gap that is conditioned on parental income. This is really important to me because the pathway out of poverty is often articulated as higher education, delaying having children until you're married, and or getting married and sort of having a two-person income. The reality is that doing those things has not actually resulted in significant changes in the Black-white income gap. And then lastly, and we'll talk about this one, again, you'll see it show up again, more than half of all Black children experience a Child Protective Services investigation in their lifetime. More than half of Black children experience a Child Protective Services investigation within their lifetime. That means that we're not just talking about poor families. We're not just talking about some of the other factors that we tend to think are the most significant predictors of child welfare involvement. When you look at communities of color, there is a significant overtouch in those populations, especially amongst Black children. And again, we'll revisit that particular data point in just a minute. So if we expect to help all children succeed, and I know that all of you do, the impetus behind caring about and doing work in and adjacent to child welfare is that you want to see kids and families thrive. That's all kids and families thrive. The reality is that in order to realize that all children and all families goal, we have to do more than just focus on closing gaps and pointing to disparities. We have to actually do active work to center and prioritize racial equity. And that is to create a desired state where all children have the same opportunity to reach the potential we know they have. That's a quote from former president and CEO of the Annie Casey Foundation. The other Casey that we do work with. So this is really just in our December meeting. We had a bunch of core concepts, really, again, to level set. And so I'm not going to rehash those today, but I added this slide just as a reminder because we're going to be talking about data and specifically talking about disproportionality and disparities. And so wanting to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to the meanings of those particular terms. Disproportionality really speaking to the particular group that we're talking about, their representation relative to a particular outcome. In this instance, it will be focused on decision points when compared to their representation in the broader population. So you'll see that called out in the data. And then disparity is in reference to differences in outcomes that a children experience based on race or other identity factors, not in comparison to their representation in the broader population. So when we look at Colorado's population, Colorado is a mostly white state, but there is a significant share of Latinx or Latino, Latina, Latinx / Hispanic children in the state, with 32% of the child population coming from the Hispanic or Latino population. You have, and then you'll see here, you have much smaller shares of other racial ethnic groups, 4% non-Hispanic Black population, a 3% non-Hispanic Asian population, and then a 5% mixed race non-Hispanic population. You'll see that the child population represented in a couple of other slides because I wanted to bring that back to you when we're looking at various decision points. When we look at sort of social economic status, children whose parents lack secure employment as a proxy for that, Black, Latino, and mixed race children in Colorado are more likely to have parents who lack secure employment. And when we think about the neglect being the broadest category of catchment for kids involved in the child welfare sector, lack of secure employment likely is a contributing factor to that. So thinking about kids and families who are most at risk for child welfare involvement, for neglect, because their parents just don't have enough income. This data point is intended to capture some of that. Additionally, in Colorado, children who are Black, Indigenous, Latino, and people of color, I use the acronym BILPOC, are more likely to live in poverty. So again, here's where you look at, I brought that overall population data where we're looking at disproportionality, whereas less than half of Colorado's children are BILPOC. BILPOC children represent 65% of the children living in poverty. Of the children who live in extreme poverty in Colorado, again, we see disproportionately Black, Latino, and mixed race children comprising the largest share of those kids. And then similarly, when we look at households where the family is at risk for eviction or foreclosure, again, looking at the needs of kids and families where they could be at risk for child welfare involvement for what may get captured as neglect, Latino and mixed race children are disproportionately more likely to live in those households where they are at risk for eviction or foreclosure, and then subsequently either being in a shelter or living on the streets or couch surfing. In Colorado, Latino children are more likely to be confirmed victims of maltreatment, and you see the blue arrows here, and this is as compared to national data. So nationally, roughly 24% of children who are confirmed victims of maltreatment are Hispanic or Latino, whereas in Colorado, 40% of the kids who are confirmed victims of child maltreatment are Hispanic or Latino. This also represents a disproportionate share of the maltreatment victims in Colorado. Again, you'll recall that 35% of the child population in Colorado is Hispanic or Latino. They represent 40% of the kids who are confirmed victims. Similarly, on the general child population data, non-Hispanic Black children represented 4% of Colorado's population, whereas here they represent 9%. So that's also a disproportionate outcome. In Colorado, Black, Indigenous, and Latino children and children of color are overrepresented in foster care. So not only confirmed victims where they could be receive in-home services of those kids who are actually removed from their parents or guardians and actually placed in foster care. 56% of BILPOC of the children in foster care are BILPOC. Of the children entering foster care, so the kids who are just being removed and entering foster care, Latinx children are more likely to enter than other kids, or than their population nationally. So you'll see here in Colorado, I'm sorry, no, then nationally, but then other kids who are entering foster care. My apologies. In Colorado, youth are more likely to, youth who reside in congregate settings are more likely to be Black youth. And here there is a stark difference when we compare Colorado's data to the national data. And this is per 100,000, the rate per 100,000 youth. Colorado is represented again on the right, and that blue color that you see is of Black children. So by and large, Colorado places more kids in congregate settings, in juvenile detention, correctional, residential facilities. And when we look at the distribution of kids who are placed in those settings, they're overwhelmingly kids of color, especially Black
I had a
kids.
quick question on that one.
I'm wondering how you count the data if a kid is like home state is a different state and that state is sending them to Colorado, then is that in their home state data or is that in Colorado's data?
That is a good question. Let me look that up and get back to you. All of these data are pulled from the Kids Count Data Center. So I'll have to look in the note to see if they have a notation about whether or not the kids are placed from another state into Colorado. My guess is that these are of Colorado's youth that are placed in one of these facilities. But I want to confirm that, and I can do that and get back to you. I'm making a note. Are there any other questions?
So I have a quick question. So I live in rural area and we have a very high population migrant community, and I'm wondering how much of this is cultural, and then if per capita, are we seeing influx at different areas of the state when we're looking at that Hispanic or Latinx community?
Yeah, I think that is, I think the question about, digging into the more localized data is an important part of the conversation. I think there is an opportunity to dig into some of that nuance, because when you look across the state, we know that there are pockets where you have greater or lesser diversity, and you just have like unique needs and challenges, right? So I agree that there is an opportunity to dig into the data in that way. I do have a question about what you mean when you say how much of this is cultural.
So we have a lot of first generation kids here. And so from their parents are not from here originally. We're not born in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about when I'm looking at your data and it's saying Latinx, and I'm thinking about the kids that I've worked with in the school systems or in private practice, I'm thinking about the barriers that they have. So non-English speaking parents, they have a culture where they're used to being disciplined in Mexico, the parents, how they were raised versus how the difference is here, where we're raising our kids, and how to what they feel is appropriate discipline, which may not be. So some of the, and even talking about it outside the home or whatnot. So it's not only those, we have so many intersectional barriers here, between socioeconomic, between cultural, ethnicity, that type of deal. So, and resources. So that was my question, is like, is there influx in different areas of the state that we've noticed?
Yeah, I think that yes, I definitely think that there are opportunities to dig into sort of the across Colorado, some of the geographical differences. I do want to sort of push on the notion, because the question comes up a lot around cultural differences as to corporal punishment specifically. And like the norms that reside in the United States regarding treatment of children that may vary from as compared to other countries. And so when you have higher populations of immigrants, then sort of like the additional challenges that cultural norms may come in. And where I want to push is that, like, the reality, though, when we look at the data in terms of, and that is, in states that have large minoritized populations, including immigrant populations from various countries, the overwhelming undergirding reason for child welfare involvement remains neglect. So we're not, by and large, talking about influxes of kids into the child welfare sector because their parents are exercising a kind of discipline that's not appropriate in the United States. That's just not, that's not a significant contributor to the rates of disproportionality that we see in the places where we see it for non-white populations. And so I think that then it forces, I think, a deeper conversation around what actually is neglect, which is intended to be willful, and what is a lack of access for a family that actually, has the same level and interest in caring properly for their kids as anyone else. And then the last thing that I want to say is that, again, I think that there is a deeper look into the underpinning of the data, because the data only provides one part of the story. Really understanding the nuance that exists in a community is important to supplement what the data tells us. But I think that part of the conversation in digging deeper is around, what differences might there be in interpreting a family dynamic as maltreatment that varies across racial ethnic groups, because we do know that in every single state, there is disproportionality. And in every single state, when you look at the circumstances, like the fact patterns of cases coming into systems, that not all kids and families are treated the same way. So the same exact set of circumstances with a family that has limited financial resources gets interpreted differently by the various systems with which that family interacts, such that some of those families, namely families of color, are reported for neglect and maltreatment under the exact same circumstances that white families are not. And so I think it's important to both understand the nuance that exists in a particular community, understanding what the particular challenges might be, where there are larger subpopulations of minoritized groups, including immigrant populations, but also to understand, to what extent are families in fact being treated differently or similarly as to the underlying needs and challenges of that family, such that there's more or less reporting.
I wanted to say something or ask questions, I'm not sure, but I agree with all of this. Like, it is not fair for these populations that they're overreported. It's not fair that they are paid less. That feels very overwhelming, and outside of the child welfare system, it absolutely needs to be fixed. And I don't know how to fix that in my seat or in child welfare in general. And as these families come to us because they're overreported, because our community does not support them in the way that they need to, I as a worker, and how I talk with my workers about it, is I'm going to work tirelessly to make sure that those children are getting what they need, without removing them, without any of that. And for me, like, the bottom line is, if this child is not getting fed and is starving, even if the family is doing everything they can and the whole system is the one that's failing them, I feel like I have a responsibility to make sure this child gets fed. So how do I combine those two thoughts and feelings that I have of the injustices of all of it, and then my responsibility to make sure that this child has what they need, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, that makes total sense. I mean, at the end of the day, the child's safety, is paramount, right? Like, and so if the child is starving, and the only way to solve for that thing is child welfare intervention, then you're going to intervene, right? I think part of the charge for this task force really is about, what opportunities might exist. And we'll have a deeper conversation with some of the leaders that we have on our panel here shortly, but like, what opportunities exist to actually have some impact, such that neglect doesn't get conflated with poverty, and what kinds of interventions might exist for families outside of the context of child welfare. Like, I don't know that, the charge today is not to solve for that. And I don't even know that at the end of the task force, we'll have, all of the solutions for all of the deep-seated community needs that could actually serve in a preventative way. But I certainly think that the conversation will move in that direction as we go along. So my short response is, girl, I don't have an answer for you. I surely wish I did. I wish there was a roadmap. I do think that there are some, these kinds of conversations are happening across the country. And again, we'll hear more about, some of the nature of the conversation here in a little bit. But that ultimately, that is the challenge of, how do we ensure that families have what they need? And it's not us, right? Like it's much bigger than us on here. But in thinking about the right time and type of intervention for child welfare and how that intervention gets referred over by reporters, how do we solve for the bigger thing, I think is the bigger question. I'm scanning to see if I can't see. So if I know that my partners in crime here are helping to push out questions and comments that come in through the chat. I can't see all of your any of your questions that come in the chat. So if there's a question that folks have, just feel free to come off mute.
Doris, there was just a comment via chat around the impacts, that congregate care data since 2019 is also probably starkly different, especially in Colorado, given the efforts here to reduce that. And so someone was just making a note there, and I've got a piece of data I think that could be helpful, so we'll share that out when I find a way to do that. It's a PDF right now, but I don't know if you want to speak to that at all. But obviously, we're working with limited data, and post 2019, a lot has happened in the world, so they're just referencing that. So
yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for that. Yeah, like I was trying to make sure that I was just using the same data set and not pulling in a lot of different data sources. Yeah, that'd be great if you have more current data. 2019 seems like a whole world away from where we are today in this like weird COVID time. So yeah, if you have additional data to share, that'd be great.
I wanted to make a quick comment too. And hi, I'm Jessica Daughter. I'm the CDAC rep for district attorneys and sexual assault resource prosecutor at CDAC. And I think you'll relate to this because it's my attorney brain talking. And I had read the article sent out to us beforehand from the family, I think it's Family Justice Quarterly, and then listening to you is just making me want to comment to say, I think that there is something that our statutory language is missing when we're talking about neglect because of intentional or negligent acts. Again, that's my attorney brain, versus because of a lack of resources, and because the inability to provide despite the attempts to provide, and like putting together that concept with all the statistics that clearly it's inherently more difficult to provide because of, like you said, some of those, obviously the historical impacts of racism, systemic racism, from jobs, mortgage, housing, all of it. And I agree with Nikki, it's overwhelming, but I think if we focus in too, and we think about that, the language that is used in mandatory reporting laws and that is taught, and if we can differentiate more between that inability to provide versus like some sort of, willful neglect, that to me is a big difference between how we can treat people and should be considered, because like you said, I don't think anybody's really out there. Most people are not out there willfully neglecting. I think it's a lack of resources and a lack of ability to provide that is not due to, a lack of trying. Anyways, I just thought that was an important piece that I kind of gained from that article and from what you were saying, and wanted to comment that I think it's an important part of our conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that in practice, I do think that there is oftentimes, and sometimes it's even impossible, like there's a lack of clarity around, I'd say lack of clarity and in some ways a lack of interest as to whether or not we're talking about willfulness or inability. And I think in some ways, I think in some ways, the question becomes like, does that matter if at the end of the day we're talking about child safety? But the impact can be significant, and if the impact, like removing your kids, right, or and if you can't solve for the thing that, like, if there are real barriers to being able to meet all of the sort of resource needs of your child or children, then the consequences of potentially not ever getting your kids back is significant, right? But I say that recognizing that, again, if the center point is child safety, and if if otherwise the kids physical and well-being needs can't be met by their parents, it just feels like a double-edged sword. And so, like, I think, how do we solve for the thing in a way that fully balances the legitimate child safety needs and really their well-being needs, and their well-being needs in the context of their family is really important.
Doris,
Yeah.
can I jump in real quick? And would you mind stopping your screen share
Yeah.
so we can, appreciate it. So we're at where we need to be for a quick break, Doris. And so I just wanted to jump in and offer one suggestion if possible. I'm seeing a lot of great questions from folks in the chat to me. I'm also seeing Kevin's hand raised. And so I think with the way that we're thinking about this next piece with panelists, but also with a continued just conversation, this has been a little bit more, us talking, you listening. And so I think we're going to try and flip the script a little bit in this next piece. And we have an hour and a half really dedicated to that conversation. So Doris, I was just going to suggest, if possible, to take that break, to table these questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So just want to acknowledge that to the task force members. And then once we really get into the conversation piece with the experts that we did bring in today, that I think is where we can start to surface some more of these questions, both related to what Doris is talking about, but also what the panelists are bringing as well. So that would be just one thing I wanted to throw out there. But yeah, Doris, I know you were wondering about time, and we are at time. So take it how you will, but that was just one thing, just based on the amount of questions I'm seeing.
Awesome. Can I offer one other suggestion? So I just had one more substantive slide that I wanted, and it's national data that I wanted to show real quick and walk through because it is specific to hotlines and reporting. And then I think going to a break, and then we can resume with the panel discussion, and what sounds like it will also be a rich conversation from this group.
I think that sounds great. And then we'll just do like a quick 5-minute break. So they'll just push us back a little bit, and that's still plenty of time.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you, Trace. I appreciate when there's someone who can keep me on task, because like monitoring I get like just caught up in the conversation, and monitoring all the other stuff is just like, I can't do all that. So real quick, I just wanted to share out some data on hotline. And again, this is national data. It's not specific to Colorado. So in federal fiscal year 2020, data show professionals submitted 66.7% of all child abuse and neglect reports. In most states, that is true, where the largest share of reports that come in from professional reporters. The largest share nationally of reports is from legal and law enforcement personnel, followed by education and medical personnel. Again, while the exact percentages might vary from state to state or jurisdiction, this theme of these two being the largest professional report sources tends to be very consistent, with then non-professionals submitting 17% of reports, and the remaining being from a host of unclassified sources. In Colorado, Black children are the focus of calls to the child abuse hotline 1.27 times more than their percentage of the population in Colorado. So we do know that there is some over-reporting on Black children that happens in Colorado. And then conversely, white children are underreported to hotlines when you look at their share of the state population. And so at about 0.64%, as opposed to a 1-to-1 ratio, balancing their representation in the state and their representation in hotline reports. So wanted to share that really quick. I will stop share again. And I think we are going on break.
We'll go on break. We'll do a quick 5 minutes. So just asking folks to be back on screen at, let's say, 9:11. And then we'll get going with our panelists. Thanks. All right, we're going to move us along. If folks want to come back on screen so we know you're there. Task force members and panelists, if you could turn your screens on, and members of the public, if you could keep those off. Thanks so much. Give it just a second, and then Jen, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, I just want to give a very brief introduction of our amazing speakers that we have today. What we've tried to do is bring you, some different perspectives. Today is really about that high level perspective on the child welfare system and this theme of disproportionality and how that appears in the system. So two of our speakers today are actually task force members. They are Dr. Kathy Wells and Dr. Ida Drury. They are both from the Kemp Center. Kathy is the executive director. She's also a board certified specialist in child abuse pediatrics. And she can talk a little bit more, but she also serves as the section head for child abuse at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. And then Ida, she serves multiple consulting and research projects at the Kemp Center, including the Child Welfare Training System, the Capacity Building Center for the States, and the Quality Improvement Center for Workforce Development. So it's great to have you here today. I know you have to be here, so it's great to have you speaking to the group. We've also invited Dr. Jerry Milner. His name might be familiar to many of you. He's currently the director of the Family Integrity and Justice Works at Public Knowledge. He's the former associate commissioner at the Children's Bureau, so that might be why his name sounds familiar. He's also been a frontline social worker in child welfare, and he also headed up child welfare in the state of Alabama. And we also have Crystal Ward Allen. She is the senior director for strategy at Casey Family Programs. She's a strategic consultant, I should say, working with the child welfare communities. She has a focus in Colorado as well as Ohio. So she is very, very well connected in Colorado and has a good eye on all the good work that's happening here. So I will turn it over to you, Doris.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jen. So this is so exciting to me to be able to have this conversation with all of you. I know it's a little wonky having a fireside chat via Zoom, but what we're going to make do. I actually had like this imagery of us sitting in these big club chairs around a fire having a conversation. So I want to start with you, Dr. Milner, Jerry. And just ask, you've done, all of you have done a lot of work in this space, but specifically in just looking at your experience both at a more localized jurisdiction and also nationally. How would you say your viewpoint around mandatory reporting specifically has evolved over time?
Well, thanks, Doris, and thanks to all of you for letting me be a part of this. I'll have to say, Doris, you have just the 10 minutes I heard before now. I think you've stolen my thunder. So thanks for that, actually. Yeah, it has. My viewpoint on mandatory reporting has changed, I would say, fairly dramatically over time. I am a social worker, and I spent time out investigating those reports, moving children into foster care, many of whom I now realize, if I wasn't fully aware of it later, that never had to be moved if we could have supported their families. And coming to understand the trauma that causes to parents and children, young people alike, has been the biggest factor in helping me, I think, change my perspective. My perspective now, to cut to the chase, is that the way our mandatory reporting system exists right now, my opinion is that it does more harm than it does good. And I think a number of changes have to be made there. But the biggest influence on me, I know that we've got the data. I can cite the data, but the source of information that has helped me to think about these things a lot differently has been sitting down with parents, young people, even younger children at times, and seeing and hearing what the effects of not just reporting, but overall, intrusion into their lives and separation has on these individuals, not just in the moment that it's happening, but for entire lifetimes. While at the Children's Bureau, I was able to visit 40-something of the 50 states, and in just about every one of those states, I was able to sit down with parents who had lived expertise, young people who had been in the system. And, it was very clear to me that there are things that warrant that intrusion. Nobody wants kids to be hurt. But that's not the most typical situation. And the trauma that we inflict on families is giving me quite a different perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I am struck by, so when some of the conversation that we had, I'm not sure if you were able to join at that point, but around, sort of like balancing this, need to make sure that kids have like what they need, physically, if families don't have resources to, adequately feed them, while also recognizing that taking kids away from their families is both traumatizing and has this like really this long-term impact. So it presents I think it puts workers and systems in a very difficult position when they have little opportunity to solve for all of the external factors outside of the child welfare system. So what are some of the things, I would say that I put this out to all of you, but I want to start with you, Jerry, and then maybe followed by Crystal. What are some of the efforts that are underway, nationally in thinking about approaches to kids, families, and communities differently, that might have a more significant impact? Yeah. Well, I can tell you a little bit about my work in this area and how we're trying to approach that with a few jurisdictions around the country. And that is, I think, a few concurrent things. One, getting a lot tighter about what gets reported, what does not have to be reported, getting incredibly tighter around what constitutes neglect. It's one of the most ambiguous terms in the child welfare industry out there, and it gets interpreted wildly different depending upon where you live, not just state, but county, city, and all those things. We have to tighten that up a bit. But the biggest thing that is my vision and my dream and my hope for child welfare is that we move dramatically towards a community-based approach to serving children and families and helping them meet their needs long before anybody thinks, I need to call a child abuse and neglect hotline here. Creating that robust network of services and supports that are available to families on a universal basis, because any of us, given the right set of circumstances or events in our lives,
might be reported or might fall into circumstances where we couldn't adequately meet the needs of our children. The more we can build those community-based supports, and I'm convinced that we can. Absolutely, Drew, happy to talk about that a little bit more later. But along with that, I think we have to create an alternate reporting structure for reporters who recognize that a child is in need, a family is in need, but it doesn't rise to the level of abuse of a child and neglect, willful neglect, as you were describing it, Doris. We have to give them other options for trying to get help to that family, and reserve hotline reporting for those most egregious situations, for those situations where children actually are in danger or who have been harmed. I don't think we want to leave mandatory reporters just kind of sitting out there with nothing to do, but that's the opportunity for me. And I think you may have pointed this out. 3/4 of the reports that come in are due to neglect alone. And I think that's where we have the opportunity to create the kinds of supports, what we call neglect. It may not be actual neglect at all, but that's where we have an opportunity to support families and help them not get into many of those circumstances, or have the ability to deal with them when they do.
Awesome. Thank you. Crystal, I mean, I saw all of you nod. Crystal, I saw you nodding a lot. What might you add to that? Like, just in terms of, what you see happening nationally, and what are some of the approaches that are emerging to, to reduce the influx of kids for reasons other than, true neglect and child abuse?
Well, I think the first thing that Jerry talked about, and I want to say thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. The first thing that Jerry talked about around the trauma to families, I can't endorse that theme enough, in that we inflict a lot of harm, and with the reports that are accepted so screened in, and I'm talking about Colorado data, about 25% are substantiated. And it varies by, it's more like 14% for educators. And a lot of so there is alternative response, which is different, but there's still like 35% that receive no services. And yet we go out and expose this family and these children to this very scary and traumatic, process. So I appreciate his comment about actually talking with families and youth and caregivers and really understanding the trauma that we've inflicted on them and maybe what they'd like instead. I do want to say, so I think moving upstream is critical. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us. And I got to give Colorado a lot of kudos for doing that. I mean, there's been a lot of work in Colorado. And when I look at, there's 1 million data points, and Doris, you gave us 500,000 of them a moment ago. One of the data points I really like is to say, what's the rate of kids that are involved in the child welfare system? And I can tell you that Colorado's rate is about 55% of what the national rate is. So for a variety of purposes, whether it's primary prevention, the screening, red team processes, the community-based local maltreatment plans that folks do, the Colorado Partnership for Thriving Families that's focused on this community-based prevention for young families, the great work that the counties do to try and keep kids out of care, you're doing a great job. And when I look at the congregate care, because Colorado was always notorious for having a very big value in residential and therapeutic healing processes, there is a decision recognition that wasn't always working for families and children and youth. and you've reduced it by about half in the past few years. So the data looks quite different today than it did in 2019. It looks different from both a rate, from a standing with other states, and from the rates for BIPOC or BILPOC, which is a new term I've just learned. Thank you, Doris. So BILPOC families. So kudos to everybody in Colorado. You're on the right trend. Nevertheless, there's so much more that could be done from a mandated reporting standpoint. I'm very excited about this task force that wants to take a bold approach, as Stephanie described right in the opening of this session. And I think that what I've seen from other states and other entities, there are lots of approaches. If you're from the legal community, you think in terms of, I want to get rid of the words intentional and, or I want to make sure the words intentional are there and maybe get rid of environmental situational. If you're training, you think, I want to train mandated reporters on what's a real safety issue. If you're a social worker like me, and I've worked both in the juvenile justice and the child welfare system, I'm thinking about how do I more authentically engage families so that they can actually quickly get whatever they need. If I'm a policy wonk, I'm looking at, can we have a growing body of evidence that shows concrete supports, whether it's increased cash assistance, whether it's SNAP, which we're getting ready to lose a lot of families on SNAP, right? Due to the pandemic, federal policies ending, whether it's Medicaid expansion, whether it's more individualized supports for families. There's a growing body of evidence that provides safety for kids and the capacity for families for parents to care for their children safely. You know, if I want to look at it from a therapeutic healing thing, I heard so much about ACEs. I said, oh my gosh, all we're saying is there's a lot of adverse childhood experiences. Children are damaged. Then I learned about positive childhood experiences. There are things we can do in everyday life, and it doesn't have to be medical model therapeutic treatment. We can provide kids with positive childhood experiences and support families in getting those kids positive. So there's a lot of things we can do. And I'll just say a couple more specific things. California has actually written a change in their neglect laws. Texas severely narrowed their neglect law. New York City has done a lot of policy changes. So there are those examples. There are also examples in jurisdictions both outside of the country and within the country where processes are going on to really say, let's transform mandated reporting from the perspectives of what we tell communities, because we've always told communities, call us, we'll fix it. If you're in doubt, just call us. Well, what we train people on are safety issues. What kind of alternative pathways do we get, which Jerry mentioned, is instead of, you've heard of mandated supporters. Well, are there some warm lines, or there's some processes we can do? And there's a lot of work going on about that around the country. I know I've talked a lot, so.
Awesome. No, you shared a lot of, I think, really good nuggets that we can, you know, as we go deeper in these conversations, in looking at models and approaches that we can leverage and learn from, in figuring out what is the right approach or set of approaches for Colorado. So I
And Colorado has so much good work to build on, is the exciting thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So and you know, and at every decision point, it sounds like, you know, there's work happening to look at and address improvements at every decision point, including at the front door. So looking forward to continuing to dig into that. I want to come back to the, you know, one of the things that you mentioned early on, Crystal, is the rate of substantiation for reports coming in that get investigated. So, you know, in most jurisdictions, reports that are coming in from your professional reporters are more likely to be investigated than those coming in off of the street. And there tends to be, as a result of that, a much lower substantiation rate of those from at least some of those groups, be it law enforcement or schools or hospital personnel. I want to come to the mandatory reporters with you, Dr. Wells, around what are some of the perceptions that healthcare professionals in particular have around reporting child abuse and neglect. I think that I think you shared there's some variability there, and I think also just thinking about like the messaging that comes from child welfare systems about make sure you report if you suspect even an inkling. So I just want to hear from you. What are some of the perceptions that you hear from your colleagues or that you have relative to reporting child abuse and neglect, and then just some of the challenges or barriers in sort of right sizing that approach.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me here on the panel, and of course, as a part of the task force. I think, first of all, I just want to say, I think that this group, I just really appreciate the breadth of perspective and expertise and knowledge on this group. I think we have a really exciting opportunity to, as you've heard from the conversation up until now, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of it, because I think that this is, as we all know, is a complex issue, right? And I'm coming to this, fundamentally as a pediatrician, trained as a pediatrician, did general pediatrics prior to doing specialty work in child abuse pediatrics. And much like Jerry said, Doris, I really appreciated your question of, has your perspective changed over time? And I can certainly say mine has, and the journey of being a general practitioner in a small community, and what I understood, and frankly, a lot of what I didn't understand about my responsibility, as well as the impact of a report, it is fundamentally different when I began as a pediatrician, and through my journey in this work. And so, my role on this group is really representing healthcare providers, pediatricians. And so it's an interesting dichotomy for me, to be truly honest with you, to think about what I've learned in the time doing this work. And so what I would say, a couple of things, right? I mean, pediatricians, as well as other mandatory reporters, we recognize that there's a moral and a legal duty to notify people when we think that children are at risk of abuse and neglect. The challenges around that, I mean, obviously we've been talking about the impact of that, and we've been talking about what we know that may create for families. And so what happens is, for healthcare providers and other folks, right? Educators, my mom's an educator. I understand the challenges in those settings, right? We have relationships with children and families, and those relationships are really important in order, in my world, to maintain health. And so I can think of many times when the question came up, they're here right now. I'm worried about what might or might not be happening with this child, but they're here and they're getting care. And I'm fearful that if I make a report, that might destroy our relationship. It might put the child at greater risk. I may not ever hear about what happens about that report. And yet I know that that's my responsibility. On the flip side, it might also be that I have this lens, this perspective, something I'm seeing that raises concern. And I have been told that there is this system that if I refer this family to, they're going to get the help that they need. And again, I may or may not ever hear about what that is. And so there's this real challenge, right? There's language that for us is really complicated. What is reasonable suspicion, right? When does that rise to that level? Do I have to, as a physician, do all the tests and rule everything out? And it's also very challenging for me to think about what is, even the word of willful neglect versus poverty, right? Like, I don't know what that, child's environment looks like. I know what I have in terms of my context in my medical office or in the hospital setting, or an educator has what's in the classroom, which has an even broader lens. And yet what we don't know is what things look like in the home. So I think it's really challenging to say what level of the role is mine to figure that out, or to refer to someone that can help sort through that. And Jerry, I love your idea of an alternative system, because I do think there needs to be something. And I think about times when I've been doing a lot of work throughout my career on infants or families that are impacted by substance use disorder. And the real opportunity we have even prenatal or at the time of delivery of an infant. And my perspective has changed in that too. I mean, I'll be frankly honest. When I was a young pediatrician and I saw a baby born exposed to substances, it's painful for me to admit this, but my first response was that child needs to go to a home where it can be cared for. And what I've learned over my career is that ideally, if we can do what we can as a system, as a society, as a community, as healthcare professionals, do what we can to support that family, that child is best served in that environment. And I remember in our very first meeting, I think it was Jill that made the comment that the best thing we can do for kids is to help their families, right? In most cases. So again, there's this challenging dichotomy, and it's not lost on me that I now run an organization where a pediatrician, recognized a very long time ago kids that had severe physical injuries, and I think I mentioned this in the first meeting, was criticized by his medical community for thinking I should bring attention to this and get help for these kids. And so that then resulted in creating some mandates around who should report that. And yet now, knowing that most of the cases are neglect, and should there be another way to address that, is something that I'm really thinking about. And the last thing that I'll say, just in terms of my perspective, is I think it's really important to think about what systems can help families and caregivers and how we can put things around. But I think that the conversation that was being had right prior to the break, Doris, that came up around, are we, and I think Nikki alluded to this, I mean, are we child-centric or caregiver-centric? And I think it's both, right? It's both and at the end of the day, to remember that we have a child that, regardless of the reason, right? I mean, whether it is willful or not, if that child is at risk, how do we as systems address that? And it's challenging as a healthcare provider, because the way that that's addressed isn't always in my office, right? Although I think thinking about this from a public health lens, I think is the right way to be thinking about this. And yet, if I'm an ER provider and I've got a kid in the emergency department, my level of contact, or I'm a trusted primary care practitioner, it provides real complication. And then I guess the only other thing I would say is training. And I know these are all things that this task force is going to be looking at, but when I started my practice, I really didn't have, I don't really remember any training about what it meant to be a mandatory reporter and what that meant my role was. And so I think it's really critically important to use that as an opportunity. I mean, everything doesn't equal training, but I think really making sure the folks that are put in positions to advocate on behalf of kids and families in this way need to have the tools. So those are some of the thoughts that I have. And I just think this is a really important conversation. I'm really pleased to be a part of it.
Awesome. Thank you for all of that, Dr. Wills. There are a few things that, I mean, you said a lot that was, I think, really rich and meaningful. There are a couple of things I want to tease out. One is, sort of the complexity of role and responsibility of folks who are in that professional reporters category, and sort of balancing like what and have access to in the relationship that you have with that child and or family, with then what are the right mechanisms to attend to those needs. And for me, it raises this question around then, sort of just I don't know if it's a question so much as it just sort of thinking about, what we are asking folks to do and consider in this space, and being realistic about what's possible is something that is bubbling up for me, because they, when we're talking about professional recorders in particular, they are professionals in a field that is not child welfare. And, there is ease in and just sort of asking and then expecting them to refer things that, that they're concerned about. I think the question then becomes, what are the right mechanisms for referral? And then what happens then to adequately attend to the needs of the child and family while recognizing that sort of the historical approach from child welfare, which in many ways mirrors policing, may not be the right approach for that circumstance. But it's complex, right? Like they're professionals in something, they're not child welfare experts. So I want to bring in Dr. Jury here on this question about then, what are some of the challenges and or lessons learned as other jurisdictions have begun to more deeply grapple with this mandatory reporting, like whether it's their laws, policies, practices, approach, and that we can sort of like have top of mind as we're thinking about, and really the we is all of you task force members, but I'm adding myself to that as we partnering with you, but that we can be thinking about in trying to kind of take the right approach for Colorado.
Absolutely. And again, as the other panel members, I'm so happy to be a part of this and also to be on the task force itself. What an amazing opportunity to have these discussions in Colorado and really in some ways lead the nation in terms of inclusion of voices of people with lived experience also being at the table. And I would say that while I'm the policy wonk that someone mentioned, my PhD was actually in public policy and around the child welfare system and the interactions of government officials with citizens, which is who we're actually talking about here, with children and families who are approached by governmental systems to meet the policy goal, which has been broadly described as child safety. I can't not mention the history because I think it's so important to the present context and can really help guide us into a thinking about doing this work differently in Colorado and really thinking about the impact that this law over time has had. Mandatory reporting, Kathy mentioned Dr. Kemp. And as someone at the Kemp Center, I can't help but mention Dr. Kemp and that legacy. I think Dr. Kemp is often credited with a lot of the policy changes that came about in 1974. He generated some national attention to the issue of child abuse when, to Kathy's point, he had been laughed out of pediatrics conferences. And really dismissed in terms of his assertion that children were being battered in a repeated way. So you're familiar with the battered child syndrome, which is a paper that came out in the 60s. The problem with that is often the problem with politics is that we very quickly developed a child protection system that responded not just to the types of cases that Dr. Kemp was highlighting as a problem, but also to encompass sexual abuse. I think the 80s were definitely a time where sexual abuse came to the forefront related to children and their safety. And I think that the intent of the time of policymakers was to ensure that secrets weren't kept related to children being horrifically harmed or sexually maltreated. The implications of which are, as we know, that trauma can impact children for their lifelong. And so I think the intent of the mandatory reporting law was really about making sure that those secrets weren't being kept from providers who are coming into contact with children. And we've seen various examples of where it has worked and hasn't. I mean, we think about some of the issues that have gone down at Penn State, and then also in the women's gymnastics world around child maltreatment, sexual assault. This became over time conflated with neglect, and therein lies, I think, the problem we're trying to address here as a mandatory reporter task force. We recognize that and actually thinkers about this started to think about this really early. Gary Melton, who was employed by the Kemp Center, he has passed on now, had a paper that we included in the materials that I would love for people to reflect upon. And the title of the paper says it all, which is Mandatory Reporting or Mandated Reporting, a Policy Without Reason. As early as 2005, Dr. Melton was really saying, you know what, this is a policy that went awry. We've developed a catchment system that is catching families and children in disproportionate ways who are in poverty, who have no business being policed or served in this way. And that conflation, I think, has continued and creates some of the barriers that we run into as mandatory reporters and as agencies that are charged to respond. The discussion about the "you make the call, we'll make the call," which is the Colorado sort of slogan for our Colorado Code for Kids hotline. Those types of approaches are really proving to be overwhelming to child welfare systems, so that the original intent of making sure that children were not significantly injured by child abuse or significantly sexually abused by caregivers and community members, we find ourselves responding instead to families in the same way as if they had been sexually abusing or physically abusing their children. And while Crystal mentioned differential response, and those of you in the Colorado system might know that, you know, we worked really hard as a team of 5 counties in 2010 to begin implementing a differential response. But differential response is after the front door. It's after a family has been reported, and we can use our best engagement skills as child welfare agencies to go out and talk to families, but that doesn't take away the stigma. That stigma then creates a problem when we attempt to address issues like neglect, because families and we've seen this actually in Colorado with Colorado Community Response. That program is for families who have been screened out by the child welfare system. And we did some research at Kemp, and that program has extraordinarily low uptake from providers. When you get a call as a family member, regardless of whether you've been screened in or screened out, but that your family has been identified as being at risk by the child protection system, rightly so, families hold that support, no matter how well-meaning, at an arm's length. I wrote a paper related to this a while back with a quote from Reagan, which is someone I don't normally quote in my day-to-day, but he really talked about the statement of "I'm from the government and I'm here to help" as being some very scary words for individuals. And that's been reflected through the voices of parents, that we are in essence responding to families who are already struggling with the stressors of life, of poverty, of balancing the variety of demands that are on family life, parents, school pickup, all the things that parents are already juggling. And we add one more thing to that mix, a call from a government agency requesting to speak with your family, sometimes speaking with your children alone, sometimes speaking with you, your partner alone, to try to get to sort of the bottom of what's occurring. And I think that that initial response and that initial approach from the child welfare system needs to end. We need to be thinking about how to approach families who are identified as being in need through the stressors of everyday life. I might go so far as to address those needs differently, and not through the child welfare system. The idea of serving these families in more of a public health approach, where we recognize that community members, family members, these are the experts on what it means to prevent child maltreatment in our communities. That's how I would propose that we would think about the rules related, especially to neglect here and the responsibilities of mandated reporters, perhaps to ask a few questions, to hold up a stop sign. You know, I imagine myself darting into situations, we've been talking about this a lot lately at the center, and saying, stop, before you call a hotline, what do you really know about what is going on in the life of this family? And how can you, as a mandatory reporter, think differently about your role to make sure that children are indeed safe from some of the most horrific cases of child maltreatment? How can we respond differently?
Yeah, so I think that sort of brings us back for full circle, right? In terms of, you know, Jerry mentioned, you know, kind of imagining a wholly different approach pathway for families that have needs that are, you know, not willful neglect and not child abuse or sexual abuse. But the reality is that there are many communities that are under-resourced already. And so you know, the question then becomes, you know, is this just big sky thinking? Or are there interventions that can actually be leveraged in communities across Colorado and, you know, nationally? And then what are those approaches that that really do work, that can be accessed, that can be implemented, particularly in under-resourced communities?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would love to hear Crystal's thinking on this also. You know, I think it involves a diversion of monies that we're using to respond in this not so helpful and at times harmful way to families. As a child welfare system, we are resourced. And we're resourced to provide the level of services that we've been providing over time, including the disproportionate numbers of neglect that we're sending workers out to families to quote unquote assess. And to Crystal's point earlier, so few of those families receiving any ongoing services or anything more than a one and done approach by the child welfare system. Because once you look into anything with any depth, you realize that this family has resource needs that can either be met by the agency or cannot, and usually cannot. And so then we're expending a lot of energy, personnel, resources already to respond in this disproportionate way. And so I think it's going to take a system to really come together and think through how do we defer those monies that are currently being used in the present structure, and thinking about how to use that. That's the only way we'll get to this grand sky thinking, Doris. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Would love to hear from you, Jerry, and others. I would say that having spent a decade in a public child welfare agency and now doing consulting with it, I don't know that most child welfare agencies would consider themselves well-resourced, where it's just about moving monies around. But that's a conversation for another day. Would love to hear from you, Jerry, on you know, sort of that resourcing question.
Well, I tend to agree with Ida with just one caveat. We've got the money. When I was at Children's Bureau, we had a $10 billion budget, which was not as much as states invest in child welfare, but 85–90% of that budget went to pay for out-of-home care. And only a drop in the bucket, I mean, literally a drop, went exclusively to primary prevention and to community-based services. We advocated very strongly for flexibility in the largest pot of money, Title IV-E, so that money could come down to the state and community levels there. So I don't think that was a huge battle for me for 4 years. And I don't think it is an insurmountable barrier, but we have to be pretty aggressive in terms of how we use the existing money, the existing resources that are out there to achieve goals and help families stay safely together. The other just brief point, and I think one of the others, maybe Ida, somebody else has already made this point, when we're talking about primary prevention and community-based care. I don't think the Child Welfare Agency can or should be the face of that. I know too many parents who have come to me and said, yeah, I needed help. We've written articles about this. All I needed was a little help and they took my kids away. True to life stories of, one mom who left a domestic violence situation after a very long time with her kids. She didn't have adequate housing, economic means, and went into the TANF office, admitted all that, and as a mandatory reporter, the TANF worker reported her to child welfare. She got her kids removed. I don't think she's an outlier. And I think a lot of this comes back to when families need help, it has to be a trusted source of help. I think one of the major reasons that we see far more Black children and Indigenous children in particular in our child welfare system is this whole idea of over-surveillance. And sometimes because of economic circumstances, they are much more exposed to mandatory reporters who we have threatened within an inch of their lives if they don't make a report. And so part of this alternative system has to be community driven, where families are comfortable. And I think there are resources out there in most communities. They may not be the traditional, government funded resources that we think about, but we can build networks of services and supports. I'd prefer to even call them supports over services that help families through difficult times and avoid more difficult times.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that, Jerry. So Crystal, you mentioned that there is work that, and you highlighted some of it earlier when you shared, but you mentioned that there's work that's happening in Colorado, specifically at the front door, closer to the front door, at that point of entry. Can you speak a little bit more deeply about some of the work that is already underway or contemplated?
Sure. So the Colorado Partnership for Thriving Families was one of the first sites for the national Thriving Families, Safer Children effort, which actually launched under Dr. Milner's leadership. And the Colorado Partnership, first of all, they made a decision. They were focused on very young families, pregnancy to 1, but kind of based up to 5 years. And they did that based on a very extreme data point, which was child maltreatment fatalities. And that most of them were about infants. So they said, if we can make a difference here, we should be able to make a difference throughout the span of this. And, it's a very innovative effort, collaborative effort. It's the backbone agency is Illuminate Colorado, which I think Jade is on the task force. But the partnership are for folks all over Colorado, public health, child welfare, DHS, other community-based organizations. I've been really impressed, a lot of pediatricians. I've been really impressed by everybody's efforts. And there's kind of been there's different ways to look at it, but right now there are some initiatives that are happening. One is an effort with the Denver metro areas, as well as I think Boulder and Eagle. I guess maybe Boulder's the Denver metro area, but to launch something called Family Connects, which is an evidence-based programming from Duke University that did all the work to evaluate it. But basically it's a visitation program at the time of birth or maybe during prenatal to really do an assessment and match whatever the right services or supports are in the community for that very, very young family to get them launched wonderfully. There's another effort that is working with family resource centers, which, you've got a fair number in Colorado through the state, I think 23, 24. And so one in Adams County, one in Prowers, so urban and a rural, and really looking at this is the front door for anything you need. And that's a community-based, the thought is this is a trusted community-based player or, service provider. So they're really trying to really enhance the array of services there. And there's another effort where Colorado has partnered with First Montana State University to really try and understand how do families really connect to get the relationships, the supports, the services they need. So kind of a lot of culture is often about pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And this is saying everybody is interconnected, and let's provide relationship at any level, whether it's a library or coffee house, or whether it's going to public health to ensure you've got the right services, or whether it's accessing some other service. So how do you try and change a cultural communication and message around that? And that work is ongoing, but I find it very exciting. At some point, Doris, I hope you'll let me talk a moment about some of the efforts for alternative community pathways that I see in other places.
Yeah, yes, you have the floor. So feel free to share those now.
Great.
I think that, I think it's important for the task force to have, just some insight into work that's already happening that, that we could be thinking about in the work that lies ahead, but also what's happening nationally and the extent to which some lessons learned can be, integrated into the approach that Colorado takes.
Well, first of all, I'll just say from my first job working in Appalachia, Virginia, it was an under-resourced community, and yet people came together to find what was needed for a particular youth or family. And I think that happens a lot more in rural America or front range America. So anyway, I just wanted to note that. I'm just gonna talk about one key effort that I know is going on in multiple jurisdictions. They're trying to develop something called community resource guides. They're holding a whole process with the community and the community of mandated reporters.
You cut out, Crystal. We can't hear you. Still can't hear you. You're gonna leave and come back? Okay. She was sharing some wonderful nuggets there too. Well, now you're muted. Okay. She's gonna leave and come back. In the meantime, we're gonna after Crystal finishes sharing some of the things that she's seeing nationally, we'll do a round robin just to see if there are any additional comments or thoughts from our panel members, and then we will open it up to our task force members for any questions that you have for any of our panelists. And then as a reminder to our guests who are not task force members, if you have any questions that you would like submitted to our panelists, if you could send those over in the chat to Trace, she'll make sure that those questions come forth for the group. So while we're waiting on Crystal to join, I'll open it up to all of you on any national practices that you see underway in an attempt to, as many places are grappling with moving forward to well, here she is, moving to prevention. You're raising your hand, Crystal, for some reason.
I did tell you I'm here.
Okay, we can hear you. Fantastic. Well, we're gonna bring it back to you.
All right, I'm going to be brief. So the community response guide, first of all, there's a big process with both lived experience, so families and youth and caregivers, as well as mandated reporters, as well as the child welfare community, to collect all information about everything, data, insights, policy thoughts, how it maybe policy solutions, etc. And then the thought, and two insights that I think are critical that we haven't really talked a lot about is in big surveys with mandated reporters and focus groups. Two of the insights that we heard was, one is
Is it just me? No, okay. Okay, Crystal froze again. For whatever reason, Zoom doesn't want us to hear what she has to say.
this liability. You have told me I'll be in big trouble if I don't report. So they're right there, both of those things. So a couple mechanisms that I've seen playing out is in New Hampshire. They are creating a navigation mechanism for hosted by lived experience families, because we talked about a trusted connection. And of course, those navigators need to be well informed about community resources in their own community, back to the community. And this is much like kinship navigation services or any other. Another jurisdiction is looking at building on something that they call the Family Service Network, which was built under a federal Children's Trust Fund grant.
We can't hear you, Crystal. No.
I think Crystal's on dial-up.
Yeah, something. Now you're all the way frozen. So I think we'll maybe we'll provide something on to the group in writing on some of the efforts on from other jurisdictions, just some highlights, and share that back so that you have that, because for whatever reason Crystal's Wi-Fi is raggedy. That's my technical term for it. So want to do just a quick round it with any closing reflections. We know that this is a complicated issue. It seems like there is a lot of alignment around the desire and need to shift more services and supports up front, to mitigate the need for families to formally be reported to and then subsequently involved in some way with child welfare, and just an acknowledgement of all of the layers of attention that will need to occur, both in training and messaging around mandatory reporting, additional pathways or alternative pathways for families, thinking about ensuring that the resources are allocated appropriately so that families do have access to services and supports outside of the child welfare system that can meet their underlying needs, as well as refinements of language in laws and policies around definitions of maltreatment and what that actually looks like, so that there is greater guidance on what should legitimately get reported for child maltreatment to child abuse and neglect. But real quick, any closing reflections from any or all of you around just where we're headed and just nuggets that you want the task force to be thinking about as we continue to engage in this work? We'll start with you, Dr. Wells.
Yeah, I just had a couple of additional thoughts. One is I think the importance, speaking as a healthcare provider and sort of thinking about mandatory reporters' role is, the importance of confidentiality is clearly important, right? These are complex issues. These are things that can expose families to, can create harm. And I think in some ways, as we rethink things, the lack of sharing of information amongst the professionals that are best positioned to be supportive of families, oftentimes, in my opinion, I think not only contributes to a lack of trust between the professions and a lack of awareness about where there can be partnerships to support families and kids, but also I think limits our ability to really leverage leverage those professionals and the passion, as was said earlier in the call. I think all of us are here because we really do want what's best for kids and families. And so I think tackling that piece, I think, would be really important. And the other piece that I mentioned training. I think it is important to think about whatever system is put in place or we want to test or pilot is really making sure that we're thinking about profession-specific tools for those mandatory reporters that also includes some decision-making criteria. I think Ida alluded to this a little bit because the reality is those folks often don't have the adequate time or support or resources to dive into things the way that maybe they would even want to. So having something that's fairly easily accessible, something that they can make that referral, because there is, I think, Jerry, you mentioned, there's a real fear, right? Like if I don't make a report, not only am I worried that, God forbid something happens to that child or family, that's, I think, fundamentally because we care about what we do, but also, am I going to be in trouble legally, right? Am I going to be fined? Am I going to lose my license? Am I going to not be able to do the work that is my heart and soul? So I think those are real concerns of mandatory reporters as well. And I guess I would love to shift that from I'm doing this because it's an obligation and I'm afraid that if I don't do it, I'm going to be in trouble, as opposed to what I'm doing, I think really is what would be best supportive to this child and family.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I think just to put a punctuation on that, Kathy, I'd love to remind folks to take a look at the resources. We have some very powerful lessons that COVID taught us, where child safety was taken out of the surveillance that is customary and placed. Children were in their homes and with their families, and what we saw was a decrease in reports, but an increase in the precision to which agencies were going out and identifying actual situations that were sort of founded or substantiated, that we were actually using what has been a blunt instrument of the system in a more precise way. And that's not to say that the reports that come in are not important, but I think there's a real need for a feedback loop between reporting parties and child welfare agencies, especially as some of these changes are being implemented. I feel for reporters who are out there who call in something that in their mind meets that muster and that concern, and then that is dismissed by the child welfare agency. Without an understanding of what that might look like or what the information is. And so I'd love to see not just a training, but an increase in feedback and conversation between mandatory reporters and child welfare agencies, almost in some ways to change the thinking from you make the call, we'll make the call, but let's make the call together and in community about what would best serve the needs of this family, and let's include the family in that discussion.
Awesome, thank you. And that was a theme. This sort of like this feedback loop was one of the themes that came out by several of you when we had our kickoff meeting back in December around, you make these reports and there's and we know confidentiality and all that, but then there's no like what ended up happening. And then like if you're a teacher and you see that kid back in school, like it's just there. If nothing else, there's an awkwardness that is created. So I like the approach of sort of thinking about it more as a partnership, and because you're all involved for ultimately the same reason, ensuring that the child's needs are met. Thank you.
Well, I'll just add something I've already mentioned. I think one of the best ways to address the mandatory reporting issue is to address what they are supposed to report. We've got to go further back, and as I said earlier, tighten up those definitions. Most every state out there right now has, and since most reports are for neglect, in their neglect definitions, they've got things like inadequate clothing and shelter and food in there. That opens the door to a tremendous amount of subjectivity, and reporting things that are not actually neglect. Homelessness is a huge component of many states' child welfare definitions. And yet I think I'm right in saying 16 states, as far as I know, not including Colorado, have a poverty exclusion, saying if this is due solely to the economic circumstances of the family, we can't call this neglect. I think a lot of these definitions come into play as an investigation or an alternative response is occurring, but I think it also can have the effect of guiding the professionals out there. And I'm quite aware of what Dr. Wells has mentioned is that, if you're a pediatrician, how do you know what those circumstances are, and how do you go about discerning what needs to be reported? That's still a big dilemma, and I won't say to you that I've got the answer to that, but I do think we have to narrow that front door at the same time that we are creating alternate ways for families to get the real help that they need, because if they don't get it, then it really could become a case of maltreatment that could be escalated.
Thank you. I really like that you sort of you named the priority around looking at mandatory reporting laws, which is a specific charge of this this task force, and the impact of that's real concrete, while the additional complementary and in many ways harder work around the alternative pathways and shoring up community-based resources and all of those can be thought about and attended to as well. All right, Crystal, we're going to try this one more time. Maybe if you turn your camera off and we can, maybe that will lessen the load and so we can look at your beautiful picture while you.
I was just going to say, I've talked a lot. I'd love to hear from your panelists or public. I'll share additional information.
All right, fantastic. Sounds good. So with that, we'll open it up to our task force members on any questions that you have. Feel free to come off mute and pose your questions directly, or put it in the chat, and our team will help us ask those questions of our panelists.
First, I want to say I'm elated in these conversations. This is so exciting for me, and I can see the passion in the room, and so I'm just really excited to be a part of this. Also, with my questions, I want to say I have a lens of the last 10 years in child welfare. I have been an assessment worker or investigator for egregious, near fatal, and fatality cases, and now I supervise that team. So I have this lens, and my risk tolerance is kind of all the way off to the side because of that lens. But my questions were around, we've spoken a lot about deprivation of necessities, quote, the food, shelter, clothing kinds of thoughts. And I'm curious what the panel's thoughts are on other types of neglect, intimate partner violence, out of control substance use, things like that. And I know, we talked a little bit about the intimate partner violence. They're hesitant to go seek services because they're afraid of the report. And so the reports are possibly impacting that. I also know from, work, intimate partner violence is a risk factor to child fatalities. And so curious on that. I was also curious, we talked about some states that have kind of changed the laws. Do we see in the data, increases of severe cases, things like that? And I was also curious of, we do have families where we have a lot of resources in our community, which are amazing. And we have, these resources providing, giving the families or offering the families what they need, and the family is unwilling or unable to access those resources for lots of reasons. They are living in poverty and it's day to day. I don't have time to go, drive down to get this resource, or I don't have the transportation. And that unwillingness or inability to access those resources are creating harm for the child. And so again, trying to balance those things out. Any any and all insight would be amazing on those questions. And I can repeat them because it was a lot if you need me to.
I just want to start by saying, Nikki, first of all, I think I appreciate you giving the context of the lens you have, because I think it's really critical. I mean, as a child abuse pediatrician, much like you described, I do see really bad things, right? And when I've sat on the child fatality review team at the state level, when we look at fatalities, we know that there is a high rate of child abuse or child-related fatalities that have a component of violence in the home or substance use disorder or other things. So I don't know that I have great answers because I think that is the part of the challenge that we face, right? We don't always know what that crystal ball holds. And what I do know to be true is the more we can encourage people to engage in systems of support earlier on, right? Because I would submit that in many of those cases, as you gather your information and you look at the entirety of the history, there were oftentimes earlier opportunities. And maybe they were opportunities that professionals did engage with the family and the family did, but oftentimes there are things that maybe someone didn't recognize or there weren't the resources available. And so that is one thing I know to be true. And we don't always know which one is going to progress. But I just also want to say thank you for naming that perspective, because I think that is a challenge, right? Is, like I said, as someone who sees really horrible cases, how do you balance that potential risk? And maybe it is a numbers game, right? That by far and above, that's not the cases we're talking about, right?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to that, Nikki, is that we did have this this unplanned opportunity to get a sense of what the risk is for kids when there aren't as many eyes on them through the COVID pandemic. And by and large, despite kids not having access to as many line of sight from many of the professional reporters and others in the community because people were on lockdown, there was a decline in referrals to child welfare that did not actually, for the most part, result in a subsequent finding that kids were largely unsafe. So like there wasn't this backlog, and then we saw this like huge spike up when kids started returning to school, where we found that kids were really, really unsafe during this period where they didn't have all the eyes on them. So it suggests that, and Dr. Drury mentioned this, like it suggests that that there has historically been this overreach that has happened, and I think provides us an opportunity to refine approaches with some data supports that again lend itself to this thinking that just reporting because you suspect and having more eyes on is better, and referring to child welfare is the best avenue, that really do challenge those assumptions. Looks like we have a couple of hands up. I didn't see which one came up first, so I'll just go with Jennifer, and then you next, Kevin.
Thanks, Doris. I just wanted to chime in a little bit on the intimate partner violence piece, and just that is my area of expertise, and I represent an organization that has victim advocates who are mandatory reporters, and what we see is that those who are being victimized are not seeking the services that could help, that could intervene, that may be protective of the children, ultimately out of fear of the involvement of the child welfare system. And many of you probably know that when this bill came forward last year, one of the things that we were advocating for was either a delay in the amount of time that advocates had to make a report, or to remove advocates from being mandatory reporters altogether, because we know there is indeed a connection between child fatalities and child welfare and domestic violence, that where mandatory reporting increases that risk. If someone comes to us for help and we make a report and a caseworker shows up at the abuser's house, the fatality risk goes through the roof. So I just wanted to chime in about kind of where I see intimate partner violence fitting into this conversation.
Awesome, thank you for adding that. And I think the other piece related to that is that, you know, in some of those instances, the children may be the only impetus behind the victimized parent leaving. And so like removing the children or having child welfare involvement in that oversight may actually be a barrier to then the victimized parent, you know, seeking help and actually leaving their victimizer partner. Thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, Doris, thank you. And thank you to the panel too for all of the information. And Doris, the slide that you had about the disparities with the detention system that we have got me thinking and wondering. I know that we have data that suggests that, you know, if a child's detained for, you know, a couple of days, it increases the likelihood that they'll continue to be detained in the future, and that recidivism will increase. And I know that we all probably have a concept for the school to prison pipeline. And I'm wondering whether the panel has any research at hand around the degree to which child removal increases the likelihood that we'll find children in the detention system. And I feel like I know that data maybe exists, but I don't have any firm knowledge about it. And I'm wondering whether anyone on the panel does.
You know, I don't have a study or, you know, numbers to quote on that. In child welfare, we refer to the foster care pipeline to detention or prison all the time. So I know that is there. What we do know is the very poor outcomes for children who spend time in foster care. You know, minuscule number or percentage actually get you know, higher education. Girls who are in foster care, you know, so much more likely to become pregnant at you know, very young ages, and the incidence of homelessness. So I think you know, we do have to look when we're making these decisions. There, in one of the other questions, the issue of the balance is there, and I think we have to be very careful and not disregard the absolute harm that removal itself does, even if it's necessary. We can't underestimate, I think, the trauma and then the escalation of that, particularly in foster care, where we have a tendency to move kids around quite a bit.
Yeah, there is data that shows that involvement in the child welfare system gives a greater likelihood of getting involved in the juvenile justice system. There's also data that shows there's a lot of, because of the really big focus and purpose focus to shrink the juvenile justice system, there are kids being presented to the child welfare system that are extremely criminalized with high levels. So I think there's a pendulum going on right now.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jerry and Crystal. Did that respond to your question, Kevin?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Hi, Michelle, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I have two thoughts just for us to be thinking about as a task force. One is that we can change the mandatory reporting laws, but one of the other problems that we have within our system, specifically the juvenile justice and the truancy court system, is that the Department of Human Services ends up getting ordered in to investigate for placement and services and to remove children and place them. Sometimes because the system doesn't function the way it should function, that families can get help on their own, and other times because the judicial system sees the department as a threatening force to be able to come in and hold families accountable because they feel that they're not able to hold families accountable. So there has to be a concurrent path to address that piece, because of that slide that you shared around the detention and residential treatment for kids disproportionately affecting children of color is absolutely impacted by that when we try to get out of a family's life, but the court forces us to stay in and or forces us to remove. The second thing that I would just say is, you know, having spent a lot of years on the investigative side of the work in child welfare, I did spend about 4 years creating and implementing a prevention program in our county. And instead of choosing, although we do have a component to help families navigate the system directly, my focus really was on enhancing the community partners' ability to serve families without making us the default system to do so. And what I learned in doing the direct practice as well as managing the practice is that our community partners don't always have the bandwidth and the capacity to help families, such as teachers who are not in the home, who don't have tons of extra time, or certainly not getting paid for that engagement, that's a challenge, but also that they don't have the skills necessary to be able to engage families and to see themselves in the families that they serve. And I spent a great deal of time trying to coach community partners how to have transparent and honest conversations with families, to say what they're worried about, what they're concerned about, and not to use us as a threatening mechanism to, if you don't comply, then I'm going to report you, or to leverage that as a threat towards families. And so my belief is until we get to the root cause of why community partners can't or won't engage families, that it will not impact, I think, this law in the way that we hope to do so. And so certainly as one county and really a small team of 3 or 4 people, our ability to support mandated reporters to the threshold that we need to support them, which is really practicing with them and in front of them about how to do all these things I just mentioned. That to me is where you're going to get most bang for your buck. It's about how to know what resources are out there, how to leverage those resources, how to navigate those resources, but they need to be the ones doing it, again, instead of making us the default system, because it doesn't work that way.
Thank you for that, Michelle. I think that the thread, I think, between, you know, both of your comments around judges and then also, you know, the various stakeholders in the community that are mandatory reporters, is the need really to have that multidisciplinary stakeholder engagement around us, you know, meeting the needs of kids and families inside the community without necessarily formal child welfare intervention. And I know that Crystal spoke to, you know, some, you know, specific, you know, she was cutting out a little bit, but some specific jurisdictional examples where they, you know, got all these stakeholders together. And so I think, you know, perhaps learning more about how that worked, who exactly was at the table, because it sounds like some of these partners were at the table in informing and then ultimately being able to execute on whatever gets codified in the law with respect to any changes to mandatory reporting in Colorado. Thank you. I see Maria, and is it Brynja? Okay, perfect. So we'll go Maria and then Brynja.
I just had a thought as far as, you know, Michelle, what you were talking about like why communities can't or won't engage families in these types of conversations. You know, as an advocate and as a trainer of advocates and thinking about, you know, mandatory reporting and all of that, like for advocates, we have the confidentiality aspect of things, but when it comes to minors, right, there's a limit to that, right? We as advocates have to report. And I think what we've often trained is like, you don't want to have all of it, because we want to maintain confidentiality and we want to maintain trust. We're not investigators, so we try to limit the amount of questions or information that we gather so that we don't have to report that, right? Because ultimately we want to empower our survivors to be able to share that information as is safe, as is needed, because they know to the best of their ability in this intimate partner violence situation or in the sexual assault or sexual violence situation, what information is dangerous to share, or what they're ready to talk about, or what they're ready to, ready to do. And so asking the questions forces us to then continue to divulge that information in a mandatory report. And so it makes it hard, right? We ask questions that are important for us to know to provide support, but so that when we report, we're able to give information that isn't taking away the power from the survivor, right? And so thinking about removing some of those barriers is going to be really important as far as, asking those questions, being able to provide the adequate resources. The mandatory reporting is a huge, huge barrier for that, because we don't want to know more than what we have to know to report. And, additionally, in terms of, bringing it to sexual violence, thinking about youth, adolescents who are experiencing sexual violence and might not have anywhere to turn, right? They don't want it to be investigated. They don't want it to be, they're not ready for it. And again, it might be more dangerous to them in terms of retaliation or anything like that. And so they're hesitant to even come to community services because, we as advocates, we're mandatory reporters. So we can't work with them until we make the report, and they know this, right? And so we see that as a huge, huge barrier for people to even come and seek support. So we don't have eyes on them. We don't have those, the opportunity to give those resources to these youth, right? And so I think that's a really important thing to consider as we're thinking about mandatory reporting requirements, asking those questions, being able to provide that support, because they're likely to not come if they know that it's going to be something that somebody else is going to be required to report. And similarly, this is the last thing, sorry for taking so much time, but I have heard of situations, I've seen situations where an adolescent survivor wants something to be done. They come to us and they say, I need this to be reported. I want to be removed. I want, I need support. And then it gets reported, kind of similar to what others have mentioned, and nothing happens. And that limits also our ability as a community services provider, as an advocate, to be able to, we can't remove people, and because they're minors, it's difficult to provide them with shelter. It's difficult to provide them with something that they're seeking. So it just makes it really complicated on both ends.
Yeah, thank you for that, Maria. I love the opportunity. I love that this is such a multidisciplinary group. And I think as we, move toward actually brainstorming some changes, this opportunity to vet the impact on the various stakeholders in their respective roles and what that might mean for reporting to child abuse and neglect. We're going to take Brynja, and then Jill, I see your hand up, and I think we will be at time. So those will be the last two comments from the task force. Thank you.
Great. So first and foremost, I just want to start by saying this is such an incredibly powerful conversation, and it's happening at the right level. I really appreciate the call out for the need to possibly differentiate systems. In my role and in my capacity, thinking about child sexual abuse prevention and then thinking about neglect, those create two very separate buckets of work and strategy that I don't think we can lose focus on, particularly when we're talking about neglect and thinking about poverty exclusions. How do we really define and engage community partners over here? As a community-facing organization, so important to think about how do we front end services, but then also how do we think about organizations and partners who serve kids that could possibly expand into more family resources, and what type of funding and support comes from both the government and the private sector to meet that objective. So that's one area my mind goes. And then the second, when we're talking about child abuse prevention, particularly sexual abuse prevention, knowing that we have great organizations like US Center of Safe Sport in our local community, and knowing that we've learned a ton from the USA Gymnastics scandal, how do we really think about child protection in a way that is doable, in a way that keeps kids safe, and that meets what I would call a very scalpel need? Like, it's very, very niche. It's very narrow. And so instead of trying to apply these rules over here to the entire system, I think we need to get really creative. And then I think we need to have a national dialogue about what is that, national and state, because I can speak specifically to the nature of boys and girls clubs nationally. Every state is different. So we get a lot of pressure to talk about sexual abuse and mandated reporting in things that aren't sexual abuse, nor are they mandated reporting, because we live in a litigious society. And so again, I would really like to see us think about this as the narrow scalpel, and this is how do we create access and change?
Thank you. All right, Jill, you're gonna round us out.
I don't know how unique of a social worker I am, but I have never let fear drive my decisions when I'm working with families. I've also never, ever left a family in distress and gone home to my own family over the past 20 years that I've been a social worker. And as long as I'm in a helping position, I want, like, my state's mandatory reporting laws to let me keep doing that without fear. And I don't want to be a mandated reporter at all. That's what I want to see in our statute. But I just want to say, to add on to what Crystal had, a long list of things that I think Colorado is doing really well. But thank you to the Children's Bureau under the leadership of Jerry a few years ago. Colorado now uses federal funding to provide preventive legal services to parents, so that parents don't have to rely on DHS for problems that cannot be resolved by DHS. So, you know, the saying that if money solves a problem, then the problem is poverty. Well, if a lawyer solves a problem, the problem was a legal problem. And middle-class rich people who are going to get evicted, or who need to go into mental health treatment inpatient, or who need whatever legal issue to happen, they hire a lawyer and they don't call DHS for help. And poor people deserve that as well. And so in Colorado, we're piloting that program. It's amazing because parent advocates, parents who navigated the system in Colorado, are on those legal teams, so that they reflect the community that needs the help. They can walk them through getting that help. And, you know, honestly, I think it's happening across the country in waves, and it's amazing. And I'm glad Colorado's on that bus. But I think this group can support that kind of work, and not having us over rely on child welfare. So anyway, we can talk more about that, like, over time, but I just wanted to put it out there that Colorado's doing a lot of great stuff. And our mandatory reporting laws are getting in the way of some of our good work.
I think that was a perfect segue to just sort of I think wrap up this conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists, Jerry, Crystal, Ida, and I'm losing track of and Dr. Wells. It's been I hope a rich conversation to get our thoughts going as we continue to roll up our sleeves and engage in this work to improve or right size the mandatory reporting laws with an eye toward ensuring equitable impact on the child welfare system and reducing disparities and disproportionality that are the net result of overbroad laws and in some ways overreach, overcatchment of kids and families. So with that, I think I am going to turn it back to Trace to round us out and open up for public comment.
Thanks, Doris, and thanks to the panelists. I just want to name to members of the public, it's a challenge, right? We want to give this opportunity for task force members to have a conversation with one another. Also seen a lot of really valuable and important questions in the chat from you all. And so, you know, we're trying to figure out a good way to engage with you all. So I think I've only received one official request for public comment, but for those of you that had comments to me in the chat, throughout this conversation, now is the time to offer that for the group. Unfortunately with timing, we don't have a ton of time to respond to that, but we do include that in the official notes back to the group to then consider as we continue building agendas moving forward. So just want to name that. And then Stephanie, I'll give you the opportunity as the chair to jump in and respond as you see accordingly, but otherwise we're kind of limited with the time piece. So the first thing I'll say, and sorry that my camera keeps clicking off automatically, I'm not sure what's going on there, but I'll keep talking, is from Heather Drusco, who had to leave, but she was with CHSDA. Just wanted to provide a note to you all that she noted that the Behavioral Health Administration has all the data from independent assessments done when a child is being considered for residential placement and treatment in a QRTP since Colorado started the process. And they have some interesting race and ethnicity data around that process that she really feels like would be helpful to dig into in this group. And so she just wanted to note that to the task force to consider moving forward to be looking at that data specifically. From there, that was her comment. I received comments in the chat, so I'm going to name folks from the public that chatted me. And if you don't want to share public comment, just let me know. And I'm going to just go in the order that I received it. So first person, and if you could limit your comments to 3 minutes at this time, that would be appreciated. I'm going to start with Sheldon. Would you like to come off and share any of your thoughts?
Wow, I'm number one, huh? It just strikes me a lot of this work, child welfare work is, and for change and meaningful and sustained change to happen, there has to be the technical and the adaptive aspects of change. And so not only just policy and law change, black words on white paper change, but also the way that we think about these things, that the public thinks about these things, and that the professionals think about these things. And so I just think it's an interesting time right now. Like there has been some really great work done in the reform and abolition movements that are currently going on, but there's a chasm happening. Of course, there's states that have anti-CRT laws, and the Indian Child Welfare Act, of course, is at the Supreme Court being challenged as a race-based law. So those are things that I kind of think about concretely. And so I'm interested in some of the adaptive dynamics that this task force is thinking about as far as change goes. And I think that has a lot to do. I'm Native American, grew up in Indian country all my life. I think sometimes the way that professionals sometimes are introduced to some of these issues are through a professional lens. And so I think sometimes the way that professionals, me included, think about some of these things is very sequential and not really capturing the humanity behind some of these things. So I would encourage the task force to that lived experience, people of color. I think definitely those voices need to be at the table to make sure that we're thinking about these things in adaptive ways rather than just maybe black letter on white paper and more toolkits and more resources, and all those things are really important. So I'm not trying to undermine those things. They're really critical things to having change, but also the most significant aspects of the way that we think, the way that we feel about these things are, and raise humanity in these things are really important. So thank you. That's my comment.
Thanks, Sheldon. And one of the things I failed to ask is, could you just quickly introduce yourself too? And if you're with an organization or just kind of, what brought you here today real quick, just for our record. I'm Sheldon Spotted Elk, Northern Cheyenne. I work with Casey Family Programs. I also serve as a Court of Appeals judge for the Ute Indian tribe out of Utah. And I was a lawyer, represented children in this process, both delinquency and dependency. Perfect. Thank you, Sheldon. Honored to have you here. So really appreciate your comment. I was going to pause there. Stephanie, I know that we had talked before this meeting because I've actually gotten a number of comments from task force members too, wondering the opportunity for that lived experience voice. And so I just wanted to give you a chance to broadly speak to how we're thinking about that when that specifically came up in our conversation, and then we'll keep moving through the list.
Yeah, thanks, Trace. Yes, as all of us can see, very large topics, very large conversation. We certainly do anticipate having many more panels than those that have been presented even here today, certainly to include those who have been reported on, right? Families and, parents who've experienced this system. We certainly are also really trying to figure out, how would we involve youth who have been impacted by this system? As all of you can appreciate, that has to be a very carefully approached conversation. It has to be trauma informed. And so as we navigate that, I just want to assure you all that those are certainly going to be our efforts, is to bring in additional voices. And again, the conversation is still very young, and you have our commitment that we will continue to richen and broaden it with that lived experience.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate that. And thanks again, Sheldon, for your comments today. Noelle, would you like to come off and provide any public comment? All right. Not sure if Noelle's still here.
I'm
but...
sorry. I'm struggling with the technology. I'm a therapist, a private therapist, and I'm also a parent with lived experience. I'm sorry I can't figure out the video. I'm just curious what the stats are about adopted children and children who have been through the foster care system and having social services called on them, children with oppositional defiance, attachment issues, who've gone from foster home to foster home, even adopted at birth, like our son was. Dr. Wells said something that really stuck with me, that mandated reporters need someone they can call and sort through what is reportable. And that has been the situation with us. Mandated reporters can't be the experts on everything, but can there be experts in this mandated reporting system who understand the certain populations? Dr. Wells also mentioned children who are born drug addicted and how they need to go to good homes where they can really be cared for. And those children struggle throughout their lives. And if those families aren't advocated for, we're going to lose those families that we need to take in these hard kids. Our son is a storyteller. He has a history. And in light of lack of evidence, not a single mark on him, the school social worker took it upon herself to embellish the story and reported that we tried to give him back as a baby and that we're abusing him because his family wouldn't take him back. It was not a true story at all. And we didn't learn this until we got the police report, how much the school had embellished what they were reporting, because there was really nothing other than his claim that we shoot him with a BB gun. Anyway, we have to clearly define what is reportable and what isn't. And it's okay. I think we need to say that it's okay if there's no more to report, if you have only one statement from a child, that it's not a mandated reporter's job to add to a story or to take it away or to make the family look guilty, that's not their job. In addition to bias being shown towards BIPOC families, I think there's some bias towards other populations like adopted children and children who've been in the system. So we actually had our case dropped by the DA, but the damage was done. I have 3 kids who are now in treatment because of the severe anxiety and trauma that this put our family through, this social worker not understanding her job and what was reportable and what wasn't. So I just wanted to share that, just some things that I hope we will talk about as the task force goes on.
Thank you, Noelle. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate your vulnerability, sharing with the group of your experience. And I'm hearing the call out specifically for differentiated data of families and kids impacted in the system. So just making a note of that for the task force as we move forward. We do have a number, Crystal, I'm seeing your hand up. We have a number of folks still left for public comment, but I don't want to shut that down. I just want to make sure that we get to them first. And then if we have the opportunity at the end, Crystal, we'll have you jump in. Kelly, so Noelle, thanks again. Kelly Parks, wanted to give you a chance to come off mute if you still had public comment you wanted to provide.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, my name's Kelly. I'm with KC Family Programs, and Dr. Milner pretty much addressed my question, but it is because of it's such a widely interpreted term, is neglect really a useful term? Unless there's concrete definitions below that, is it even useful to have in the conversation?
Appreciate that, Kelly. I know, like you said, Jerry spoke to that earlier, and also just a pin in that for the group to consider moving forward around that term neglect came up multiple times in the conversation. Thanks, Kelly, for your comments. Going to move in our last public comment, and then we're right at 5 minutes left, Stephanie. So just as a time check, Kelly, and I apologize, please correct me if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Haviland.
Hi, how are you? I've got a couple or a few. One of them is when we were talking about, I guess I'll just skip to the question. When children are biracial, who determines whether they're getting listed as Black or white or whatever race? Number one. Second question is, there's been several important people talking about the fear of being a mandated reporter. And I agree that there needs to be a special avenue just of mandated reporters that the mandated reporters can link with and discuss, because I feel like the children that are vulnerable, the most vulnerable, who have been abused and neglected and are in the court system, they depend on those mandated reporters. CASA, mental health resources, they depend on those people. And if those people are scared to do their job, I mean, that's putting those kids in a shark-infested water. And those kids need the most help, absolutely. That's all.
Thanks, Kelly. One of the pieces I'm seeing is we're gonna, if folks that have commented can message me your contact information so that folks from our team can follow up directly, both to answer questions, but also just further engage in the conversations of what you all are bringing up. Would really appreciate that. So if you could drop in whatever you're comfortable with, email, cell phone, etc., send it to me and make sure we have that collected. So to all of you, I really appreciate the comments and the questions, and we're running short on time. So Stephanie, I'm going to hand it over to you and then we'll close it out.
Great. Thanks, Trace. Yes, just to close, I want to thank really first, task force members. Thank you for being here today. 3 hours is a very long time to listen and to learn, but I really want you to know how much we appreciate your questions and your thoughtfulness as we discuss these issues. I secondly really want to thank our panelists for sharing your time and your expertise with us. I know all of you very personally, and I think I could have a full day with all of you easily, one at a time, to discuss and really tap your knowledge and your experience and your research and your writing. So by way of saying thank you for sharing your time today, and please know that this will not end our conversation with any of you, because I know there's a great more deal to share. I also want to thank our public commenters who came today. Thank you, members of the public, for being engaged and for being part of our meeting. Our goal from the very beginning was to use an electronic format so we can ensure that as many members of the public who want to be involved can be involved. And I also want you to know that while you were given those 3 minutes to provide comments, the reason I ask for contact information is that I can follow up. Again, I value your opinions and I want to make sure that we give enough time to hear from you. So that would be the reason, to provide that info. Of course, thank you, facilitators, for keeping all of this on time and all of this running, and really to our CPO team, who also provided a lot of effort in putting out agendas and minutes and corresponding articles and arranging speakers. So thanks to Jen and thanks to Jordan and Michael, our communications person as well. So on that note, I feel like that was an Academy Award speech or something. My apologies, but I just think it's important to show appreciation because I am deeply appreciative. We will look forward to seeing you at our next monthly meeting, which is now, April, which is hard to believe. And you will certainly be hearing from us in terms of just additional agendas, our path forward. And I will personally also be in touch with you by then. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Stephanie, I'll also, sorry, just to add, we have an exit survey for folks that I'm dropping in the chat right now. And so if folks, that's just a chance for you to give us feedback on, you know, each section of the agenda, the conversation today, how might you shift some of the facilitation moving forward. So really, really, really appreciate folks taking just a couple minutes to fill that out. The link is in the survey, and then obviously you can always reach out to our team as well for additional feedback. Thanks so much. And as Stephanie said, we'll see you next time. I appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.